Powell River.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm here to speak on this particular bill because it is so important to the people that I represent in North Island Powell River. It's a very large riding, covering half of Vancouver Island and parts of the mainland as well. So it's really important to me as I serve coastal communities. These communities have a long history of resource economies, and in our resource-rich area, the ocean is a large part of our economy. In these changing times, many people from across my riding have spoken to me about the challenges that they face. Many members of the communities I serve have spoken to me about increasing challenges to make a living fishing in our region. Licenses are getting increasingly expensive, leaving the smaller family-owned businesses struggling. Most concerning, Mr. Speaker, is the growing scarcity of wild salmon in our region. It is important for me to discuss legislation like Bill C-68, an act to amend the Fisheries Act and other acts in consequence, as it touches so directly and profoundly on the lives of residents and our coastal communities. The Fisheries Act is a key federal law for fish habitat protection, one of the key laws for marine biodiversity, and an essential part of Canada's environmental safety net. On October the 25th, 2017, Oceana Canada released a review of the state of Canada's fisheries and how the government is managing them. Most concerning to me, Mr. Speaker, was how the results told a story of serious concern. In Canada's fisheries, only 1/3 of the stocks are considered healthy, and 13% are in critical condition. Canada's fishing industry employs more than 79,000 employees and exports more than $6 billion worth of seafood annually. In my riding, we have businesses that focus on seafood processing, like Celtic Seafoods in Port Hardy. These local businesses are an important factor to the economic backbone of these regions. They hire local people, keep jobs in the areas that need them, and are so close to the resource of seafood. When our marine stocks are in trouble, this has a significant impact on businesses like these. It also has impacts on the tourism businesses in our region that flourish due to the natural habitat. Mr. Speaker, be it in Telegraph Cove, Up Butte Inlet, Gold River, Campbell River, Tlaiamin, or Sonora, just to name a few of the robust tourism communities, if you want to experience the beauty of whales, wild salmon, eagles, or bears, we have them all. And all of them rely on the marine stocks. The other concerns that I have been hearing from the Indigenous communities that I have the pleasure to represent is the lack of access to seafood resources for traditional food of the people. Many of these communities rely on the food of their ancestors, and as it becomes harder to access, many people are struggling. Visitors to my riding do not have to be there long before they understand the importance of the water, how the ocean and inlets provide a livelihood for the people who live there. They are our water highways and roads for jobs. It is so easy in our fast food, plastic wrap world to forget the food chain from the food on their plates back to the earth and the waters, to the farmers and men and women who fish. It is too easy to disconnect ourselves from where our food comes from and how much that food needs to be healthy, safe, and enjoy the protection of good laws and regulations. This is a vital role that this federal government plays. We saw with the previous Conservative government a disrespect for our fish habitat. The government gutted provisions that offered protection. Changes made to the Fisheries Act in 2012 removed protection for fish and for habitat. I am not surprised that 4 former ministers who wrote the former Prime Minister Dupuis, all the changes all came from British Columbia. We on the West Coast know its importance. 2 of those ministers, Sedin and Fraser, were members of the former Prime Minister's own Conservative Party, but he did not listen to them. In fixing the loss of that protection, it is important to recall the huge public outcry then opposing the Conservative government legislation. More than 700 scientists wrote the government, urging them to keep habitat protection in the Act. First Nations communities in my riding and across British Columbia spoke out against the changes. Conservative organizations, recreational fishers, and concerned citizens joined First Nations, demanding that we do everything possible to protect fish habitat. As Jeffrey Young of the David Suzuki Foundation notes, quote, "Without healthy habitat, fish can't survive. These changes are important tools to fight badly degraded habitat from resource development across Canada, as well as prevent species extinction," end quote. My party and I welcome this legislation. We give our support now for second reading. The progress we are making in protecting our fish habitat is happening in part from the good work of the New Democrat Party and committee, including the amazing advocacy of my colleague from Port Moody, Coquitlam. This bill implements some of the recommendations made by the NDP and our dissenting opinion on the Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans review of changes made in 2012 to the Fisheries Act and the management of Canadian fisheries. This legislation is a good start, but I fear the government does not go far enough to address protection. Let me state first what I like about the changes proposed in this legislation, and then what needs to be better. It is good that we are again more specific on what we must be on guard against. It is good that we are now talking now about harm, about altercation, about disruption, and about the destruction of fish habitat. And we are again restoring the definition of fisheries to include all fish. Now, when making a decision under the Fisheries Act, the Minister will have to consider any adverse effects that the decision may have on the rights of Indigenous people of Canada, recognizing and affirmed by the Section 20 or 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, include provisions respecting the consideration and protection of traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples of Canada, and authorize the making of agreements with Indigenous governing bodies to further the purpose of the Fisheries Act. This is long overdue. This respects and begins the process of a nation-to-nation relationship of governments. This is something we will all be watching very closely. These changes will provide measures for the protection of fish and fish habitat with respect to works, undertakings, or activities that may result in the death of fish or to their harm. We will need to be vigilant on the regulations still to come to ensure that an ecologically significant area will truly be protected. There are several such ecological areas that are significant and sensitive in my riding. There can never be too much protection given the human, financial, and ecological consequences from any accidents. I find that the expertise in my region of local sports fisheries and Indigenous communities are key here. The benefits of hearing those voices who care so deeply for the habitat and the success of our marine life will assist in making good policy. I hope that the Minister remembers to use that local knowledge. So much of whether this law will lead to good practice will depend on the regulations. Suzanne Fuller, Ecology Action Centre, has said, quote, "It's a big step that the new act includes that the Minister must take into account whether or not rebuilding measures are in place for depleted species. However, details on rebuilding will be in the regulations," end quote. Still, even with this progress in fish habitat protection, I still have concerns on if this legislation has gone far enough. I'm concerned that this bill still does not address the conflicting mandates which Commissioner Cohen identified conserving wild salmon while promoting salmon farming. This needs to be clarified, and it is still not being addressed. Another concern I have is the need for strong regulations that follow the passing of this legislation. This will need to be clear with timelines and targets and take into account the impacts of climate change and species interactions. I note that the bill gives a great deal of discretion around decision-making to the Minister, allowing decisions to be made based on the Minister's opinion rather than enshrining the necessary strong guidelines in the law. This has me concerned and vigilant, along with many who are at the forefront of protecting our fish habitat. I'm concerned, too, that this legislation does not look at protecting environmental flows. This is so important. With this bill, we see undone the bad laws of the previous government. Let's ensure that we do everything to make sure that this is a good law, the best possible law, and regulations to truly protect our fish habitat. The activists, the scientists, the businesses, and the First Nations communities are asking for a better bill. Mr. Speaker, in closing, the people of North Island Powell River rely on the strength of our coast to provide recreation, beauty, and economic development. Protecting these investments are so important today and into the future. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Qu'est-ce que commentaire? The honourable member for Yukon.
Thank you. I appreciate the speech. I just wanted to make a comment as opposed to a question, but just to put on the record that from my jurisdiction, the riding, we're so happy that the recent agreement with the Arctic nations to preserve the Arctic Ocean from fishing until the stocks have been evaluated and to see if there are stocks there that can actually be fished, to hold off all the countries that would like to fish there. And I assume the member with her very positive speech would agree with that initiative.
The honourable member for North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for that statement. You know, the reality is, as I work and live in the riding that I serve of North Island Powell River, I hear from so many different communities. So many of the fisheries folks who come and talk to me, and they talk about how well they work in that environment and make sure that they're watching to see what's happening, because they want to preserve and conserve that region. They want to make sure that we have healthy habitat for fish and strong fish into the future. And so, you know, when you hear from those kinds of sectors, you hear from the Indigenous communities saying, you know, there's so much that we could be doing, we need to protect, we need to maintain, because this is our food, this is the wealth of our communities. You know, it's a wonderful thing to see that come together. Again, though, I think it's important that I state that the minister still holds a lot of power, and we need to make sure that decisions are not made on a minister's opinion, but it is made on science and the information that is given to us. Too many people rely on that resource, and we must respect it.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Port Moody, Coquitlam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from North Island Powell River for her excellent speech and for her passion for representing her riding, an important part of the coast and coastal communities. And she talked about how important this piece of legislation, the Fisheries Act, to her area, to the coastal communities, and how important it is to get it right. Now, she also spoke about local knowledge, traditional knowledge, and the importance of including traditional knowledge. And that, in fact, is being reflected in this bill, which is a good step. It's a good first step. But in fact, it's a small step. And I wonder if my colleague could talk about the importance of going the next step, which is talking about co-governance, co-management, and actually looking at UNDRIP and recognizing what UNDRIP is all about when talking to First Nations and the importance of the fishery to First Nations and their knowledge.
Member for North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for this really important question. You know, I have the honour of representing over 20 Indigenous communities in my riding, and they range across a broad area, and the issues that they face are very diverse and very similar. And one of the challenges that a lot of the communities have talked to me about is being able to work and harvest in the resource in our marine life, both for traditional purposes, but also as a way of having their own economy. And how many things have changed and how that's had a huge impact on their ability to have good jobs in their small, sometimes very remote communities. So I think this discussion of nation to nation, of really looking at working together and governing together is so important. There is so much knowledge, and when I sit down with the leadership, when I sit down with the elders, I hear that knowledge, and I really hope that this minister will start to step in that direction of understanding that since forever, the First Peoples have lived here. They know their territory. They have history that comes from so far back that 150 years doesn't even touch that. And they want to share that. They want to make sure that their locations are cared for, and they want to be a part of that process. You know, I think of, we had a terrible diesel spill in one of the parts of my riding not too long ago, and the Indigenous community were there on the scene. And they said to me afterwards, you know, we just want to be part of the process so that when this happens, we can activate, we can do something. But we were sitting there waiting, being told we couldn't be part of the solution. When are we going to be part of the solution? And I think that that discussion is really the next step. And I look forward to seeing that happen. And I know that the nations in my riding are watching that. Thank you.